Dawn rose slowly over the Philippine Sea, its first light sliding across an ocean already tense with expectation. A thin haze lingered above the waves, softening the horizon into a pale, uncertain line. Yet aboard the American carriers, the uncertainty had shape. It glowed on radar screens, faint signals at first, mere tremors in the static. Then signatures, gathering, strengthening, pointing toward something vast moving just beyond visible range. The operators said little. They simply watched as the sky they had trusted for months began to thicken with possibility. On the open decks, lookouts lifted binoculars and narrowed their eyes against the rising sun. What began as drifting specks soon sharpened into the unmistakable silhouettes of approaching aircraft. Dozens, then more. They came in layers, stepping down from high altitude like a staircase built from clouds. The fleet had prepared for this moment, yet the scale felt unfamiliar, as though the Pacific itself were sending a warning before the enemy even arrived. Admiral Raymond Spruant stood in the subdued light of the command center, tracing the unfolding threat across the plotting boards. For all his experience, the challenge before him remained obscured by the fog of incomplete intelligence. Japan's intentions were broad, ambiguous, and potentially catastrophic. He understood only that the largest carrier engagement in history had entered its opening breaths, and that clarity would not come until the shooting started. Meanwhile, on the American flight decks, pilots tightened harnesses and exchanged brief nods. Many had fought through the long arc of the Pacific War. Exhaustion lived in their bones, but so did a practiced resolve. Engines warmed, trembling through steel like a heartbeat. Across the sea, young Japanese aviators climbed into their cockpits with far fewer memories to carry. Some had barely mastered the basics. Their commanders hoped numbers might fill the gap left by years of irreplaceable losses. Within hours, the sky would turn into one of the most uneven air battles ever recorded, an event U.S. pilots would later call the Turkey Shoot, and Japan would remember as the moment an entire doctrine unraveled. South of the Mariana Islands, the Japanese combined fleet pushed forward in a formation that still carried the language of pre-war confidence. Admirals believed that a single, overwhelming engagement could halt the American advance, an echo of the old decisive battle doctrine that had shaped their naval thinking for decades. Yet beneath the surface of that belief lay an unspoken truth. The fleet now lacked the strength that doctrine required. Its ships moved with purpose, but also with the weight of a strategy built for a world that no longer existed. Across the ocean, American codebreakers had already taken much of the mystery out of Japan's intentions. Long before lookouts spotted silhouettes on the horizon, analysts had mapped the likely approach, the timing, even the shape of the Japanese counterstroke. Their quiet work allowed the U.S. Fifth Fleet to assemble deliberately, drawing carriers, battleships, and cruisers into a layered ring of protection. What appeared from above as an orderly design was, in reality, the visible form of information supremacy. For Japan's aviators, preparation looked very different. Years of attrition had hollowed out the veteran corps that once defined their naval air arm. Replacements were rushed through training, their practice flights stripped down to essentials. Many struggled even with takeoff procedures or the long, unforgiving navigation drills required to cross the Pacific's empty expanses. They were asked to perform the most difficult missions of the war with the least experience the service had ever fielded. The Americans, by contrast, carried lessons written in survival. Their pilots had moved through the Solomon Islands, the Gilberts, the Marshalls, each campaign refining tactics until coordinated strikes became instinct rather than instruction. It was an advantage forged not from theory but from accumulated hours, repairs in dim hangars, and the memory of what happened when mistakes went uncorrected. Distance only widened the disparity. In the Pacific, orientation was life. A single navigational error could scatter formations or doom a pilot to drift unnoticed until fuel and hope ran out. Even before the first shot, the vastness of the ocean acted as an unseen arbiter, favoring those who could read it. As the two fleets closed the gap between them, each carried assumptions about how the coming battle would unfold. But assumptions, like doctrines, had a breaking point, and both sides were about to discover where theirs lay. The first Japanese attack wave rose from the decks in a loose, determined column, roughly 69 aircraft pushing eastward across an expanse of open water. From a distance, they resembled a moving seam stitched hastily across the horizon. Their engines carried the confy, dense of a doctrine that still believed in sudden, concentrated blows. even as the men inside the cockpits understood how thin their margin for error had become. Hundreds of miles away, U.S. radar screens lit with quiet certainty. The operators who watched the blips drift inward did so without urgency, calling out ranges with the steady cadence of men who had rehearsed this moment again and again. At more than 100 miles, the Americans already knew what was coming. The warning bought minutes, precious minutes, that would shape the sky long before the first aircraft came into view. F-6F Hellcats lifted from the carriers in disciplined arcs, climbing toward the intruders with the practiced efficiency of crews who trusted both their machines and one another. They formed into layered divisions, trading altitude for advantage, then rolled over into steep intercepts that cut directly into the heart of the approaching formation. In that instant, the contrast between the two air forces, experience measured against desperation, became unmistakable. For the Japanese pilots, cohesion dissolved almost immediately. Radio discipline slipped into confusion, instructions overlapped or fell silent, and formations stretched thin as younger aviators struggled to keep pace. What had departed as a unified strike now frayed in the wind, each aircraft fighting the sky as much as the enemy. Below them, the American carriers came alive. Anti-aircraft batteries spoke in harsh, rhythmic volleys, sending layers of steel upward until the air itself seemed to ripple. Tracers carved bright paths through the morning light, intersecting the disordered attackers with mathematical indifference. When the smoke drifted apart, the ocean reflected the cost, scattered debris, spreading fuel slicks, and only a handful of surviving aircraft fleeing back into the distance. In those quiet seconds after the guns fell still, a realization settled across the U.S. fleet. The enemy pressing toward them was no longer the formidable air arm that had once dominated the Pacific. Something fundamental had changed. And as another wave began to form beyond the horizon, the Americans understood that the true measure of that change had yet to reveal itself. Japan's naval strategy was born not in the chaos of war, but in the controlled arguments of the interwar period. Within the halls of naval colleges and planning bureaus, theorists shaped a vision of conflict that rested on a single, elegant idea. One climactic fleet engagement would determine the balance of power in the Pacific. Battleships would stand as the final arbiters of victory, and every movement of the fleet would serve to prepare for that moment. It was a doctrine rooted in tradition, but also in a belief that history could be persuaded to repeat itself on command. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto understood that the world was shifting, even as he worked within the framework he inherited. He recognized that aircraft carriers, once auxiliary tools, were becoming instruments capable of reshaping battles before the first salvo was ever fired. His vision redefined the opening phase of the decisive battle. Carriers would strike from afar, softening an enemy weakened by surprise, leaving the traditional artillery duel to finish what naval aviation had begun. It was a hybrid doctrine, part innovation, part inheritance, and its contradictions would follow Japan into the Pacific War. The early victories seemed to vindicate Yamamoto's interpretation. Pearl Harbor stunned the United States. The Philippines and the Dutch East Indies fell in rapid succession. Japanese pilots, many trained over years of rigorous instruction, executed their missions with a precision that convinced their leaders that the decisive battle concept still held its power. In those months, it was easy to believe that shock alone could neutralize a nation whose industrial potential had yet to awaken. But that belief carried a hidden flaw. Japan assumed that America's enormous production capacity could be outrun, or at least stunned into irrelevance. Carrier decks expanded, air groups multiplied, and new hulls slid into the water in a show of national pride. Yet the training pipeline, slow, demanding, and built around elite standards, did not expand with equal speed. The fleet grew, but the reservoir of experience did not. Guadalcanal exposed the imbalance with merciless clarity. What began as a contest for a single runway soon became a grinding campaign that siphoned away Japan's most skilled aviators. Losses mounted faster than new pilots could be trained. The very airmen who had shaped Japan's early victories disappeared into the Solomon Sea, replaced by recruits who carried far less flight time, far less preparation, and far fewer chances of survival. And still the doctrine endured. Japanese leaders believed that spirit could compensate for training, that resolve could substitute for proficiency. It was a faith born from cultural conviction and wartime necessity, but it carried a price. By the time the decisive battle finally arrived, not as one duel, but as a series of desperate engagements, the doctrine that had guided Japan for decades stood hollowed out, honored more in memory than in practice. Yet even as its foundations crumbled, another assumption remained unchallenged, one that would shape the final hours over the Philippine Sea in ways few on either side fully understood. In 1942, American naval aviation entered the war with confidence but little cohesion. The battles of Coral Sea and Midway were victories, yet they revealed painful gaps in coordination, preparation, and sheer experience. Squadrons often fought as collections of individuals rather than unified teams, and losses, though expected, carried lessons the Navy had not yet learned how to translate into doctrine. Each downed aircraft underscored a reality the United States had not faced in generations. Naval air power required more than courage. It demanded structure. As the Pacific widened into a battlefield stretching thousands of miles, U.S. aviators discovered that their early war methods were not enough. Radio procedures broke down under stress. Attack runs lacked the timing and precision needed for sustained success. Even the aircraft themselves showed their limits, built for a world that was vanishing as quickly as the one Japan's doctrine had assumed. The war was accelerating, and America needed a system capable of accelerating with it. By 1943, that system had taken shape. American factories, vast, synchronized, and protected by a homeland untouched by enemy fire, began producing carriers, aircraft, and spare parts at a scale no other nation could match. What might have taken years now took months. What required months now required weeks. The Pacific Fleet watched new decks appear on the horizon with such frequency that the tempo of the war seemed to pivot around industrial output alone. Training followed the same logic. The Navy standardized flight instruction, transforming raw recruits into coordinated units rather than talented soloists. Pilots learned not only how to fly, but how to think together, how to build formations that behaved as extensions of a single intention. It was discipline that created competence, and repetition that turned competence into instinct. The Americans were discovering a truth that would define the rest of the war. Mastery came not from brilliance, but from practice refined to the point of inevitability. Into this new structure came the F-6F Hellcat, an aircraft designed with clarity of purpose. It was simple to fly, rugged enough to withstand punishment, and engineered specifically to counter the Zero's famed agility. The Hellcat did not need to outdance its opponent. It only needed to survive the first turn, climb, and strike from a position earned through superior training. For the pilots who flew it, the aircraft became a symbol of a larger transformation, one in which reliability mattered as much as innovation. Attrition, once a looming threat, became manageable within the American system. Losses were recorded, replacements were delivered, and squadrons regained strength without collapsing under the weight of experience drained away. It was a cycle Japan could no longer sustain, and one the United States had learned to manage with a cold, methodical efficiency. By mid-1944, a new belief had taken hold among American commanders. Superiority did not emerge from inspired maneuvers or singular heroes. It came from scale, discipline, and the repetition of processes honed until they became unbreakable. But as the fleets moved toward the Philippine Sea, even this confidence was about to be tested in ways the Americans had not fully anticipated. By 1944, the air groups that had once defined Japan's naval power existed mostly in memory. The aviators who had struck Pearl Harbor, who had fought over Midway and the Coral Sea, were gone, lost to battles where victory had come too late to matter or defeat had offered no survivors. What remained was a shadow of the force that had once moved across the Pacific with precision and confidence. The Empire still possessed aircraft. What it no longer possessed were the men capable of flying them as their predecessors had done. Japan's pilot schools tried to fill the void, but the foundations of training had cracked beyond repair. Replacements now received fewer than 100 flying hours, a fraction of what wartime conditions demanded, and a small echo of the standards once held before fuel, time, and experienced instructors became luxuries. Many young aviators entered combat having never fired their guns in live practice. Their skills existed largely on paper, evaluations written by instructors who understood that there was no remedy for shortages of fuel or time. Fuel scarcity reshaped everything. Advanced instruction, once centered on the complexities of carrier landings and coordinated attack maneuvers, shrank in to theoretical lectures and brief, constrained flights. Trainees might circle inland fields, but they did not learn the subtle, punishing demands of arrestor wires or pitching decks. When these pilots were finally ordered to sea, they stepped into cockpits with only a partial understanding of the world they were expected to master. The irony deepened as aircraft production rose. Factories worked tirelessly to deliver new machines, their assembly lines moving with determination despite the shrinking industrial base. But the aircraft rolled out faster than pilots could be trained to fly them, and faster still than veterans could be replaced. Planes accumulated on runways and carrier decks, impressive in number yet hollow in purpose, symbols of an air arm that had outgrown the very human expertise required to wield it. Instructors, once the backbone of Japan's aviation excellence, were repeatedly pulled from the training pipeline and sent back into frontline units. Each reassignment might have strengthened a squadron for a moment, but it weakened the system that produced aviators in the first place. The cycle broke. Without teachers, there could be no students. Without students, there could be no future for naval aviation. Yet within headquarters, a belief persisted. Japanese officers argued that superior spirit, the intangible strength of resolve, could compensate for the shortfall in experience. It was a conviction born from centuries of military tradition, but one increasingly detached from the realities of modern industrial warfare. Spirit could guide a pilot's courage. It could not teach him navigation, gunnery, or survival at altitude. And as the fleet steered toward the Philippine Sea, Japan prepared to test that belief one final time, a test the coming battle would answer with devastating clarity. American innovation in the Pacific did not begin with engines or armor. It began with electrons, moving silently across cathode screens in dimly lit rooms. Engineers had spent years refining radar systems that could read the sky long before human eyes detected movement. By 1944, these sets could track aircraft across distances that once seemed unimaginable, turning the ocean's intensity from a tactical burden into a strategic advantage. What had been guesswork in 1942 became measured information, precise enough to shape decisions hours before the enemy arrived. Yet radar alone could not win the war. Carrier task groups reorganized themselves into layered defenses, each ring designed to absorb a different threat. Fighters patrolled high above, forming a shifting canopy of steel and vigilance. Picket ships pushed outward like sentinels, their antennas sweeping the horizon for shadows on invisible wavelengths. Rapid-fire guns stood ready on every deck, filling the lower sky with a density of fire that no aircraft, however fast or determined, could easily penetrate. The arrangement resembled a moving fortress, but one built not of stone, rather of planning, coordination, and lessons purchased through earlier mistakes. Inside the heart of each task group, a new innovation transformed how commanders understood air combat. The Combat Information Center, once an experimental concept, had evolved into a nerve center where officers synthesized radar data, radio traffic, and reports from lookouts in real time. Here, battles no longer unfolded as isolated bursts of action. They became patterns visible on illuminated boards and headsets. Decisions that once lagged minutes behind events now guided them, shaping interceptions with the precision of choreography. U.S. pilots trained to match this emerging system. Their practice shifted from individual marksmanship to the complexities of deflection shooting, where success depended on predicting where an enemy would be rather than where he was. Formation tactics grew sharper, emphasizing coordinated interception rather than lone duels. Squadrons learned to move like linked parts of a single machine, spreading, climbing, attacking, reforming, each action reinforcing the fleet's larger rhythm. It was a discipline that turned instinct into calculation, and calculation into survival. Behind them, maintenance crews worked in a world as demanding as combat, though rarely remembered with the same clarity. Their task was to keep aircraft ready at all hours, even when the pace seemed impossible. Engines were replaced between sorties, bullet holes were patched in dim hangars, ammunition belts were reloaded by hands that never stopped moving. These crews understood that a plane on the deck was a plane not in the sky, and the sky was where the war would be decided. What they accomplished on rolling decks bordered on the miraculous, enabling sortie rates that no enemy force could match. By mid-1944, the U.S. fleet resembled something entirely new, an industrial ecosystem afloat. Fuel ships replenished carriers in calm seas and heavy swells alike. Ammunition barges delivered shells and rockets with the precision of assembly lines. Workshops repaired aircraft, engines, radios, even broken tools, ensuring nothing essential remained damaged for long. The fleet did not rely on distant supply ports. It carried its own lifeblood across the Pacific. It could move, fight, repair, and move again, all without ever touching land. This transformation did more than strengthen American naval air power. It made it predictable. Processes that once varied by ship or circumstance became standardized, repeatable, and scalable. The Americans had turned air combat into a system of interlocking parts: detection, communication, interception, repair, and adaptation. Each step fed the next with an efficiency that grew sharper with every engagement. What began as improvisation in the early months of the war had matured into a weapon of relentless consistency. And as the fleet approached the Philippine Sea, officers aboard the carriers believed they had built a machine capable of withstanding anything Japan could summon. But the true test of that machine, its limits, its vulnerabilities, and its unforeseen consequences, was now waiting just beyond the horizon. By the summer of 1944, Japan placed its hopes on a single operation: AGO. It was a plan shaped by urgency rather than opportunity, built on the belief that the U.S. invasion of the Marianas could still be reversed if the American carrier force were drawn into a carefully prepared trap. Japanese commanders imagined a sweeping engagement in which land-based aircraft from the islands would hammer American ships, clearing the way for carrier groups to close in and deliver the decisive blow their doctrine demanded. The plan contained elegance on paper, but it relied on assumptions that no longer matched the state of Japan's air arm or its understanding of the enemy. The land-based air units stationed across the Marianas were expected to act as the backbone of the operation. They were to soften American defenses, weaken fighter screens, and provide reconnaissance that would direct the carriers toward vulnerable points in the fleet. But the pilots operating from Guam, Saipan, and Tinian were already worn down by earlier battles. Their aircraft were aging, their fuel stocks thin. And their ability to coordinate with the carrier force, once the hallmark of Japan's naval air supremacy, had eroded into a patchwork of partial reports and missed signals. Worse still, reconnaissance failed at the moment it was needed most. Japan entered the operation with only fragments of information about American movements. Clouds, distance, and U.S. fighter patrols prevented scout planes from closing the gap. Without accurate sighting reports, admirals were forced to rely on intuition rather than observation. They knew an American armada approached the Marianas, but they could not chart its exact position, nor estimate its true strength. In a war fought across thousands of miles, this blindness proved lethal. Life aboard the Japanese carriers reflected the strain. Pilots trained in haste, practiced on cramped decks under relentless heat, and carried the burden of tasks once reserved for aviators with years of experience. Illness spread easily in the humid quarters. Exhaustion dulled judgment. And everywhere the awareness lingered that the fleet no longer possessed the depth or resilience to absorb losses. A single mistake could ripple outward, crippling an entire air group. Commanders held tightly to one remaining confidence: radar. Japan believed its detection equipment, though limited, would provide enough warning to give the carriers the first strike, an advantage that had defined naval warfare since 1941. What they did not know was that American radar had evolved into something far beyond their expectations. It could track aircraft across immense distances, coordinate interceptions with precision, and guide fighters toward enemy formations long before they broke through the cloud line. In the coming hours, Japan would launch its waves under the illusion that surprise still belonged to them. For the aviators preparing to depart, these strategic realities narrowed into something personal. Many gathered on the flight decks before dawn, kneeling on steel warmed by the night air. They prayed, not for victory, but for the chance to return. Even the most optimistic pilots understood the imbalance in training, in machinery, and experience. Their survival depended not on doctrine, but on luck and the slim hope that the Americans might falter. Engines thundered as aircraft lined up for launch, their wings glinting under the rising sun. The carriers pitched gently, and flight crews signaled the pilots forward. What rose into the sky was less an elite strike force than the remnants of a system stretched beyond its limits, held together by determination and the memory of a navy that once ruled the Pacific. Operation AGO moved forward with its internal contradictions fully exposed, faith reliant on outdated assumptions. Tian's bravery constrained by dwindling capability, strategy shaped by information gaps too wide to bridge. Japan believed it was maneuvering toward a decisive confrontation. In reality, it was advancing into a battle defined as much by miscalculation as by firepower. And as the first formations disappeared toward the horizon, the Americans were already watching them on radar, quietly preparing to answer Japan's final gamble with a level of coordination unlike anything the Pacific had yet seen. As the Japanese strike waves closed the distance, the American carriers did not rush. They measured. Radar plots drifted steadily across glowing screens, each mark a warning written in quiet increments. Controllers studied the patterns, then issued calm, deliberate instructions. Far above the fleet, the first groups of F-6F Hellcats began to climb, rising in clean arcs that caught the early light on polished wings. More squadrons followed, launching from multiple directions, filling the sky with an order that contrasted sharply with the scattered formations easing toward them from the west. The Hellcat had been designed for this moment. Its speed exceeded that of the Zero. Its armor absorbed hits that would have torn earlier models apart. Its 6.50 caliber guns carried enough firepower to end a duel in seconds. The Zero had once defined agility over the Pacific, but time had eroded its supremacy. American engineering and the hard lessons of a difficult first year had produced a machine that eliminated the advantages Japanese pilots once relied upon. At altitude, the difference felt less like evolution and more like inevitability. American pilots approached the intercept with a sense of practiced calm. They called out bearings with clipped precision, adjusted altitude in response to radar cues, and coordinated attacks as if following choreography written long before takeoff. From the cockpits, the incoming waves appeared not as a unified force, but as a succession of small, struggling clusters, groups that shifted uneasily as they attempted to hold formation. The veterans among the U.S. squadrons recognized the signs immediately. The Japanese pilots were inexperienced, navigating a sky that demanded judgment they had not been trained to develop. When the Hellcat struck, the formations unraveled. Japanese aviators attempted to tighten their spacing, but their reactions came too late or too unevenly. Radio calls overlapped, wingmen drifted out of position, leaders broke away under pressure. What had departed their carriers as coordinated strike groups dissolved into scattered fragments, each pilot fighting alone against opponents who had learned to fight as a unit. The battle, from the American perspective, unfolded not as a contest, but as a sequence of rapid decisions executed with quiet certainty. Some Japanese survivors pressed forward, attempting low strafing runs against the distant shapes of U.S. carriers. It was an act of determination, not strategy. Few reached the outer defenses. Anti-aircraft fire rose to meet them in layered sheets, and the Hellcats circled back, completing the work before the attackers ever saw the decks they had been sent to destroy. The vast distance they had crossed now became a corridor of fire from which almost none would return. One U.S. pilot, watching the waves break apart beneath him, later described the scene with a phrase that carried no triumph, only disbelief. A conveyor belt of targets. His words reflected not arrogance, but the sober realization that the battle no longer resembled the hard-fought struggles of earlier years. The disparity in skill, technology, and coordination had grown so severe that the outcome felt preordained even as the fighting continued. Below, the carriers maintained their steady course. Gunners tracked the sky with disciplined movements. Flight officers monitored their boards. Damage control teams waited for tasks that never came. The fleet had prepared for the worst, yet almost none of the attackers reached striking distance. The disproportionate kill ratio, so vast it startled even seasoned commanders, became clear long before the last aircraft fell into the sea. But numbers did not tell the whole story. The Americans sensed, in the quiet moments between engagements, that they were witnessing the collapse of something larger than a single strike. Japan's air arm, once the terror of the Pacific, was breaking apart in real time, its final gamble undone not by a single mistake, but by years of accumulated strain. And as the surviving Hellcats formed up to return to their carriers, another radar plot began to emerge. Another wave on the horizon, carrying with it the same certainty of what the next hour would bring. By midday on June 19th, the shape of the battle had already begun to tilt unmistakably in one direction. One Japanese strike wave after another had broken apart under the pressure of coordinated American interceptions. What should have been a series of desperate duels had instead unfolded as a pattern, predictable, controlled, and astonishingly one-sided. U.S. losses remained minimal. The sea beneath the carriers was calm, the sky above them was not. Inside the radar rooms, operators continued their work with the same steady voices they had used since dawn. New contacts appeared as faint glimmers on the screens, drifting inward from the west. Instead of alarm, the announcements came as routine lines spoken into headsets. Range, bearing, altitude. Fighter directors responded with quiet adjustments, redirecting Hellcat divisions from one altitude to another, aligning vectors until the air battle resembled a carefully rehearsed sequence rather than the chaos of earlier Pacific engagements. The Americans were no longer reacting to attacks, they were shaping them. On the carrier decks, the pace intensified. Launch and recovery cycles overlapped in a rhythm that seemed almost impossible on the confined space of a moving ship. Aircraft thundered down the decks, lifted into the warm air, circled, and then peeled off toward new intercepts. Returning fighters slammed onto the arrestor wires, were rolled aside instantly, refueled, rearmed, and sent back into the sky. It was controlled chaos, a choreography refined by months of practice and supported by crews whose efficiency had become a weapon in its own right. Above the sea, U.S. pilots began transmitting numbers that stunned even the most seasoned commanders. Dozens of enemy aircraft fell each hour, Zeros, Judies, Kates, shot down in patterns that revealed just how far Japan's air arm had deteriorated. Some pilots reported tally counts they had never imagined possible, not as boasts, but as statements of fact delivered with a tone of disbelief. Each engagement ended before the Japanese could mount a coordinated response. Each climb, dive, or roll only deepened the disparity. Many Japanese flights never even found the American fleet. Lacking experienced navigators and deprived of accurate reconnaissance, they flew across the empty Pacific searching for carriers that radar-equipped U.S. fighters could position themselves to protect. Some groups, low on fuel and unable to locate their targets, simply vanished into the vastness, lost to miscalculation rather than enemy fire. For aviators trained in a tradition built on discipline and precision, the failure to even reach the battlefield echoed more painfully than defeat. It was during these hours, as wave after wave crumbled, that an informal phrase began circulating among the Hellcat squadrons. A nickname whispered into radios or exchanged over debriefings, the Turkey Shoot. It was not born of triumph, but of shock. The pilots had expected danger, strain, and sacrifice. They had not expected an enemy so unable to defend itself, nor a battle where the outcome became clear long before the last aircraft fell. The term captured a mismatch that felt almost surreal. For Japan, the meaning of the day struck with devastating finality. The battle was no longer a contest of skill or courage. It had become a revelation, a clear, undeniable demonstration that the core of its naval aviation had collapsed. Doctrine, tradition, and spirit could not overcome the loss of veteran aircrews, the erosion of training, or the rise of an opponent whose system now functioned with industrial precision. What began as Operation Ago, envisioned as the moment to halt an American advance, instead exposed the irreversible weakness of Japan's position in the Pacific. As the afternoon light shifted and the final debris settled across the water, the Americans were already preparing for the next set of contacts. Radar screens continued to glow. Fighter directors continued to speak. The system they had built, the machine forged from training, technology, and relentless adaptation, was working exactly as intended. Yet even now, amid overwhelming success, one question lingered at the edge of the horizon. If Japan's air arm had been defeated so completely, what would the fleet discover when it finally turned its eyes toward the enemy carriers themselves? By late afternoon, the scale of Japan's losses had become unmistakable. Strike wave after strike wave had dissolved before reaching the American carriers, leaving the enemy fleet exposed and retreating across the western horizon. It was then that Admiral Markmitcher faced a decision that would define the closing hours of June 19th. If the U.S. carriers launched now, the strike group might not return before nightfall, a prospect every pilot understood carried its own deadly calculus. And yet the opportunity was too rare to ignore. If they struck before darkness swallowed the sea, the Japanese carrier force might be destroyed in a single blow. Mitcher gave the order. Flight decks erupted into motion. Crews prepared torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighter escorts with a speed born not of urgency, but of practiced certainty. Pilots climbed into their cockpits with the knowledge that their return would test not only their navigational skill, but the limits of their endurance. For many, it would be the first time they attempted to find a carrier at night, a task so perilous that earlier in the war it bordered on impossible. The sun dipped lower as the strike group lifted into the sky, forming a long, purposeful ribbon of steel stretching westward. Beneath their wings, the Pacific glowed with the soft, reflective sheen of early evening. Ahead of them, however, the world was fading into a dim haze where distance and shadow blended until nothing could be trusted without instruments. The aviators pressed on, scanning the horizon for any sign of the enemy fleet that had eluded destruction earlier in the day. They found it. Through breaks in the cloud cover, the silhouettes of Japanese carriers emerged, ships already battered, their decks crowded with damaged aircraft that would never fly again. The American strike descended with quiet precision. Bombers rolled into dives, releasing their payloads with the steadiness of men who had rehearsed the sequence 100 times. Torpedoes slid into the water, leaving white trails across the growing darkness. Fire blossomed across the deck of Hio, the flames building until the carrier slipped beneath the waves, taking with it the remnants of Japan's hopes for continued carrier warfare. But victory carried a price still waiting to be paid. As the strike group turned eastward, the sun vanished completely, replaced by a night without a visible horizon. The pilots faced an expanse of black water stretching 200 miles to reach carriers running darkened for their own protection. Compasses steadied them. Dim cockpit lights marked the passing minutes. Yet nothing erased the knowledge that one miscalculation could scatter the formation beyond recovery. Mitcher knew the danger. He also understood the responsibility that accompanied the order he had given. As reports filtered in that the returning aircraft were struggling to locate the fleet, he made a decision so bold that officers on the bridge questioned it at first. Turn on the lights. Across the American task force, ships broke blackout. Searchlights stabbed upward, forming pillars of white that reached into the night sky. Anti-aircraft batteries fired tracer rounds, not at enemies, but as luminous guideposts for the pilots still searching the dark sea. The entire fleet became a beacon, a glowing silhouette that risked enemy attack to save its own. One by one, the returning aircraft appeared, some gliding with engines barely running, others damaged from the earlier assault. Pilots lined up behind the carriers, grateful for the thin ribbons of illumination marking the decks. Many made it back. Many did not. Dozens ran out of fuel and ditched in the ocean, their crews rescued through long hours of searching that extended into the following day. Yet despite the losses, the evening strike had achieved its purpose. Hio was gone, several other carriers were damaged, and the Japanese fleet's ability to wage carrier war had been crippled beyond repair. What had begun as a risky gamble ended as a decisive blow, one that revealed the scale of Japan's collapse in a way even the most optimistic American planners had not expected. The Pacific fell silent again as the last searchlights flickered out, restoring darkness to the sea. But the meaning of the night lingered, an understanding that the balance of naval air power had shifted permanently. And as dawn approached, the Americans prepared to discover what remained of the enemy fleet still fleeing into the west. By the morning of June 20th, the scale of Japan's losses could no longer be disguised by hopeful reports or fragmented radio messages. More than 350 aircraft had vanished in less than 2 days. Machines, yes, but also men. Navigators, gunners, and pilots whose training had once required years of patient refinement. The air groups that had launched from Japanese carriers with the promise of restoring balance to the Pacific were now gone, replaced by silence across the flight decks. In the stillness that followed, even veteran officers understood that something far greater than material strength had been lost. The carriers Shikoku and Teiho had once represented the pride of Japan's naval aviation. Their decks had launched the attacks on Pearl Harbor, sailed through the early triumphs of 1941 and 1942, and carried some of the last remnants of the pre-war elite. Now both lay at the bottom of the Philippine Sea. Teiho, the new flagship, had succumbed to a single torpedo and the fatal decisions that followed. Shikoku, a veteran of nearly every major battle, had been consumed by fire and internal explosions. With them sank not only aircraft and crew, but the irreplaceable experience of men who had shaped Japan's early dominance in the Pacific. The surviving carriers, Zuikaku, Junyo, Hio, and several light carriers retreated in a loose, uneven withdrawal. Their decks were nearly empty, many could not launch aircraft at all. The formations lacked cohesion, their commanders deprived of scouting planes, fighter screens, and the confidence that once defined their operations. There would be no counterstrike, no carefully coordinated final blow. What remained of Japan's naval air power was scattering across open water, hoping distance alone might shield them from further pursuit. While the Japanese fleet fled westward, the American sailors faced their own long night. The evening strike against the retreating carriers had returned in fragments, planes low on fuel, pilots dazed by exhaustion, and crews who had navigated hundreds of miles of darkness guided only by the beams and tracers of the U.S. ships. Throughout the night, destroyers fanned out to recover aviators forced to ditch at sea. They pulled men from rafts, from shattered aircraft, and from the cold expanse where the Pacific revealed both its beauty and its indifference. Each rescue carried a quiet recognition. These pilots had crossed the limits of endurance to end the threat that had haunted the Pacific since 1941. For the Japanese officers who gathered in dim, war-damaged command rooms, the truth emerged with the inevitability of a tide. Their naval air arm, the force that had once stunned the world at Pearl Harbor, that had struck with unmatched precision at the Coral Sea and early in the Solomons, was finished. Not damaged, not depleted, finished. What remained could not be rebuilt. There were no instructors left to train replacements, no reservoir of fuel to support extended practice, no veteran cadre to pass down the lessons of 4 hard years of war. The decisive battle they had envisioned for so long had indeed arrived, but not as the symmetrical duel of fleets firing in measured volleys. Instead, it had come as a collapse that unfolded in hours, accelerated by miscalculation, outdated doctrine, and the burdens of an industrial war Japan could no longer sustain. The very philosophy that had guided decades of naval planning had evaporated under the relentless weight of radar-guided coordination, disciplined American pilots, and a system designed to absorb losses rather than be broken by them. For Japan, the defeat carried implications far beyond the loss of ships. It shattered the strategic foundation upon which the entire Pacific war effort had been built. Without carrier air power, the fleet could no longer project strength. Without trained aviators, even new ships would remain impotent. And without the hope of regaining the initiative, the road ahead narrowed into a path defined by defense, attrition, and the slow retreat toward the home islands. As the sun rose over the Philippine Sea, wreckage drifted across waters that only a day earlier had been filled with the engines of hundreds of aircraft. The ocean was quiet now, holding the remains of a doctrine, a strategy, and a generation of aviators. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the next phase of the Pacific War was already gathering pace, toward islands whose names would soon be etched into history with equal weight, but at far greater human cost. When the surviving Japanese aviators returned to their homeland after the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the silence that greeted them spoke louder than any official report. Training fields that once echoed with the drone of engines now lay quiet, their runways marked by weeds and wind-blown sand. Classrooms stood half-filled, staffed by instructors who looked more like custodians than teachers. The men who stepped off those returning transports expected to rejoin a living institution. Instead, they found a system that had withered beyond recognition. The losses of 1944 could not be replaced, not because Japan lacked aircraft, but because it lacked time. The experienced cadre that had once defined the Imperial Navy's aviation strength had been erased in the span of months. These were men who had survived the long arc of the early Pacific campaigns, who had navigated the complexities of carrier operations with a calm born from thousands of hours in the sky. Their absence was more than numerical. It was cultural. Without them, the knowledge that had anchored Japan's air arm evaporated, leaving only fragments for new pilots to inherit. Meanwhile, factories continued to produce fighters and bombers at a pace that defied the shrinking supply of trained aviators. Assembly lines delivered aircraft in neat rows, Zeros, Judys, Miats, each machine representing the outline of a capability that no longer existed in practice. They gleamed beneath hangar lights, ready in every sense except the one that mattered. There were simply no masters left to fly them. What once had been the Empire's proudest instrument of power, now resembled a museum arranged for a war already lost. Within naval headquarters, conversations turned increasingly toward measures previously deemed unthinkable. The reality was stark. Japan could not hope to match American production, training, or technology. The only resource still abundant was human will. Special attack tactics, once whispered as theoretical extremes, now circulated through planning rooms as a grim but logical extension of the nation's dwindling options. What had begun as strategic improvisation threatened to become official doctrine. Senior leaders felt the weight of irony in these developments. Early in the war, Japan had taken great care to preserve its highly trained pilots, rotating them home to teach the next generation. It was a system built on continuity. But as the pressure of attrition mounted through 1943 and 1944, that preservation eroded. One by one, the veterans were pulled back to the front, thrown into battles where the margin between survival and loss narrowed to almost nothing. The strategy that once protected Japan's aviation heritage ultimately consumed it, and there was no way to rebuild what had been lost. The air battles of 1944 marked more than a military defeat. They signaled the end of Japan's offensive capability, the moment when strategic initiative passed irreversibly to the United States. No matter how many aircraft Japan produced, the empire could no longer shape the course of the war. It could only respond, defending what remained while the horizon of possibility contracted around it. Military planners understood that the coming campaigns would be defensive not by choice, but by necessity. The age of sweeping strikes across the Pacific had ended. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, compressed into a few hours of clarity, became a watershed in Japanese militarism. It forced a reckoning with the limits of doctrine, the fragility of elite training pipelines, and the brutal demands of industrial war. For a nation that had built its strategy on the belief that spirit could compensate for material disadvantage, the events of June 1944 delivered a lesson stripped of sentiment. Modern warfare did not yield to courage alone. As the remaining pilots walked across their quiet airfields, the dusk settling over the grass, they carried with them the unspoken realization that their world had changed. The sky, once Japan's greatest field of dominance, had become a place of diminishing return and increasing sacrifice. And beyond the horizon, the next stage of the war, one defined not by ambition but by survival, was already beginning to take shape. With Japan's naval air arm shattered in the Philippine Sea, the American advance into the Marianas unfolded with a sense of inevitability. What had once been islands guarded by some of the finest aviators in the world now lay exposed, their skies undefended, their runways vulnerable. For U.S. forces arriving by sea and air, the absence of Japanese air resistance felt less like an opportunity gained than a sign that the Pacific War had entered a new and unfamiliar phase. Where once every mile had demanded caution, now the momentum itself seemed to pull the fleet forward. Saipan fell first after weeks of brutal fighting. Tinian followed, then Guam, each island seized not simply as territory, but as platforms from which America could now reach further than ever before. Airfields expanded across the volcanic soil, their long, pale runways stretching toward horizons that pointed directly at Japan. Engineers worked with a speed that mirrored the nation's growing sense of strategic purpose. They knew what these islands meant. From here, the war would no longer be fought at the limits of endurance. It would be fought from positions designed for reach. Soon, the great B-29 superfortresses arrived. Machines larger, heavier, and more technologically advanced than anything previously deployed in the Pacific. Their engines echoed across the Marianas at dawn and dusk, a sound Japan had never heard before. When they lifted into the sky, they carried not just bombs, but a transformation of the war itself. The conflict, once measured by carrier ranges and island chains, was becoming a struggle defined by long-distance power, by aircraft capable of crossing oceans and returning to tell the story. While the B-29s prepared for their first missions, the carrier air groups refined their own tactics with the precision of craftsmen sharpening a tool already well honed. The lessons of the Philippine Sea, interception geometry, radar coordination, disciplined formations, were studied and distilled into doctrine. These aviators knew the war was not finished. Ahead lay Leyte Gulf, Okinawa, and the final battles where Japan's remaining strength, however diminished, would be spent with fierce resolve. The carriers would need every advantage they had built over the past 2 years. Among American commanders, the memory of the Philippine Sea lingered, not as a triumph to celebrate, but as a moment demanding reflection. The asymmetry of the engagement had been unprecedented. Dozens of U.S. pilots returned with kill counts that defied expectations. Entire Japanese strike waves had been erased before reaching their targets. It was victory by every measurable standard, yet the ease of it carried a sobering message. Japan was no longer capable of fighting the war it had once envisioned. The empire's military machine, once feared across the Pacific, now revealed the strain of years spent fighting a modern industrial opponent without the resources to sustain itself. To the American public, news of the battle arrived as headlines celebrating overwhelming success. Newspapers spoke of record-setting kill ratios, of enemy carriers sunk, of daring night recoveries that bordered on legend. But few grasped the deeper implications. The destruction of Japan's carrier air power meant the Pacific War was no longer a contest of maneuver. It was becoming a war defined by strategic reach. Bombers striking from thousands of miles away, carriers sweeping across seas without challenge, and a nation whose industrial strength had matured into a force capable of shaping outcomes long before battles began. The Marianas stood at the heart of this transformation. What once were distant islands had become the forward edge of a new kind of warfare, one in which distance no longer protected Japan and time no longer favored gradual resistance. The map of the Pacific, once vast enough to conceal fleets and delay offensives, now felt smaller, more navigable, more predictable. And as the first B-29 formations lifted off toward the distant outline of the Japanese homeland, a new chapter of the conflict opened, one that would test not the mobility of fleets, but the endurance of nations. Historians would later look back on June 19, 1944, and mark it not simply as a battle, but as a boundary, a line between what Japan's naval power had once been and what it would never be again. In the span of a single day, the empire that pioneered carrier warfare in the Pacific ceased to be a carrier power at all. The event earned its darkly memorable nickname, yet beneath the simplicity of that phrase lay a deeper truth. The Philippine Sea was the moment when an entire military tradition met forces it could no longer contain. The sinking of Shikoku, Tahoe, and Hio captured headlines, but ships, however impressive, were only tools. The true devastation lay in the loss of the men who had flown from those decks. Japan's trained aviators were not merely specialists. They were the product of a system that had once demanded years of study, discipline, and precision. When those pilots vanished into the Pacific, the tradition they embodied vanished with them. No ship could replace that. No factory could reproduce it. The fleet could be rebuilt in steel. The skill required to use it could not. Mechanical strength, once thought to be the foundation of naval warfare, revealed its limits with painful clarity. Aircraft continued to roll from assembly lines, and new carriers would later steam into service, but without the mastery that only time could cultivate, these machines lacked meaning. The Pacific had always rewarded technical excellence, but it demanded human expertise even more. In 1944, Japan discovered that when the two diverged, only one could carry the weight of war. For decades, Japanese naval aviation had been defined by qualities admired even by its adversaries: discipline, coordination, and a precision honed through countless hours in the air. Its pilots once exemplified the highest standards of their profession, but the system that produced them had no defense against the industrial scale of American training and manufacturing. Doctrine met economics, and economics did not flinch. On the American carriers, the victory brought no celebration. Most aviators understood the enormity of what the day represented, not triumph, but a turning point in which one side's collapse became evident in real time. The U.S. pilots spoke with a sobriety unusual for such a decisive victory. They had seen the faces of the young Japanese aviators who fought them, had witnessed their confusion in the air, and had realized that courage alone could not reshape the battle. The tragedy was unmistakable. Japan had not run out of bravery, it had run out of time. In the analysis that followed, the Philippine Sea became more than an account of tactics or technology. It became a study in preparation, how wars are shaped long before shots are fired, in classrooms, workshops, and training fields where habits of excellence are either nurtured or neglected. Japan had built an elite force, but it was a force that could not be replenished. America had built a system, and systems, unlike individuals, could endure attrition. June 19th revealed the consequences of these choices with a precision no strategist could ignore. Japan had entered the war believing that superior skill might overcome material disadvantage. It ended the day confronted by a lesson written across the sky in smoke and debris, that modern warfare punishes a NY doctrine, unable to grow with the conflict it seeks to dominate. As the sun set on the Philippine Sea, the world saw the result of that imbalance. Japan's carrier arm had not been defeated in the traditional sense. It had evaporated, leaving only fragments where a formidable force had once stood. What disappeared that day was not merely an air force, but a legacy. And beyond that horizon, the next phase of the war awaited, one shaped not by mastery of the sea, but by the reach of bombers and the hard decisions still to come.